Really, it is such a pleasure to have Dr. Aaron Koller here with us. I never watched him fall off a roof like David did, but I've known him since I think 2007 or so. From, I don't know, something like that. I spent 6 years at Drisha. They all kind of smushed together. And while I never had the privilege of taking one of his semester-long classes with him, I certainly, had many opportunities to learn with him over the years, and it's always a pleasure. And back BC, before COVID, we had talked about him coming down and giving a lecture because he recently published a wonderful book on the Akedah. And of course, like everything else, that was paused. And then we said, you know what? We're just going to turn all of these into Zoom lectures. And so we're delighted to welcome him here tonight. We have a great lineup of we're calling it our fall winter guest speaker series coming up, and we'll be releasing those details as they become available. But would love everyone to stay tuned for more of that. I don't like to just read bios off the page. So I will just say that Dr. Koller, as he said, is a professor at Yeshiva University and has a book on the Akedah, as well as a big master book on Esther in ancient Jewish thought. And like I said, it's just really a wonderful educator and a wonderful mind. And we are delighted to have him here. And I believe we will now mute all participants. And then Aaron, your co-host, you should be able to unmute yourself. Harris, you on top of that? Great.
Yeah, that worked. Oh, it's eerily quiet now. So first of all, I want to thank Maharat Ruth for making this happen. I was excited for the opportunity to come down to Washington. Hopefully it'll happen some other time. And it's nice that you said that you never had a chance to be in my class. I always think I never had the chance to sit with you in class. Whatever the relationship would have been, I'm sure it would have been great to actually learn on a prolonged level with you intensively, but we spent a lot of time in the same Beit Midrash. So that was really a treat for a number of years. And now it's just always amazing to watch all the fantastic things that you're doing and that your shul is doing and that you're doing with the shul. So it's a real treat to be here, an honor to be here. I'm going to share my screen and put up these slides. There we go. So just one thing, PowerPoint just a few minutes ago asked me if I wanted to try out closed captioning. So I didn't know this is an option. I assume you see this on the bottom of my screen, on the bottom of your screen as well. I assume it's going to go badly once I start using Hebrew, but it might help here and there if there's any audio issues or if anyone just having, typically has trouble hearing. So I figured I'll turn it on and see how it goes, and hopefully it won't be too distracting. Okay, so we'll get started. I'm going to ask you, I will pause a couple of times and ask if there are questions or comments at that point, but please feel free also to put anything in the chat if you just have a thought or a question. And when we do pause, I'll check in on the chat and see what people have been saying. Okay, we are going to start with the question. It sounds like a provocative question. Did Avraham fail the Akedah? The truth is, if you Google that, if you look up, people who have said that Avraham fails the Akedah, you find out that it's not such an uncommon theory. People have been arguing off and on that Avraham failed the Akedah, but typically that comes with paying some sort of textual price. In other words, it comes as part of a theory that maybe the story as we have it in the Torah right now is not the original story. Someone added something to sort of clean it up, or the tradition is not the authoritative tradition. And that's because the story as we have it is pretty clear that Avraham did well in the test. It starts off, that this was a test that God gave to Abraham. And then after Abraham is willing to sacrifice his son on the altar, the Malach comes down and says, now that you've done this, now that I've seen that you did not withhold your son from me, here's your reward. So it makes it as clear as possible, really, that Avraham did well in the test. So the burden of what I want to do in the next few minutes, the first part of what I want to look at, is to try to show you that actually, although that's true, the text also gives us a few hints that things were not perfect, that things actually were, there is reason for concern and reason to conclude that the story doesn't end on a happy note. So there's two things I want to work through with you. The first is the phrase, they walked together, vayilchu yachdav. And we have this 3 times in the story of the Akedah. So who does Avraham walk with in the story of the Akedah? Well, on the way to the mountain, he and Yitzchak are walking together, and you have this on the top pasuk here on the slide. Vayilchu shnehem yachdav, the 2 of them walk together. That's in pasuk vav in the story. Right after that, Yitzchak asks Avraham, and he says, Dad, where is the sheep? And Avraham says whatever he says. And then again, Vayilchu shnehem yachdav, the 2 of them walked together. So in pasuk vav and pasuk chet, we have Avraham and Yitzchak both walking together. But then at the very end of the story, after everything is all done, the last line, pasuk yud tet, so verse 19, we have Vayashov Avraham el Na'arav, Vayakumu Vayilchu Yachdav el Be'ershava, Vayeshev Avraham be'Be'ershava. Abraham then returned to his servants, Vayilchu Yachdav, and they walked together to Be'ersheva. And commentators for at least a couple of thousand years have noticed that Yitzchak is missing in this pasuk. That the first 2 times that Abraham walked together with someone, he was walking together with his son. The 2 of them walked together, the 2 of them walked together, and the Midrash says the 2 of them walked together. They were partners in their service of God. That's an interpretation, but certainly noticing that the 2 of them walked together repeatedly, that's just an observation. But here at the end of the story, Avraham walks together, but not with Yitzchak anymore. Here he returns to his servants and they walk together. And that's an observation that has led many people to say, it looks like there's been some rupture here. Whether or not we conclude that Yitzchak is physically not there is a harder question. I'll come back to that in a second. But certainly emotionally, existentially, the idea that Avraham and Yitzchak had been walking together on their way up the mountain, but on the way down the mountain, Avraham walks alone until he meets his servants, and then they walk together. Now, is Yitzchak trailing behind? Maybe. But even if so, Avraham and Yitzchak are not walking together. They're no longer tied in the same way that they were on the way up the mountain. And that suggests that something has gone wrong on the family side here. In other words, that between Avraham and Yitzchak, something has in fact gone wrong. Now, I said a minute ago that whether or not Yitzchak is physically there is a different question. So there have been commentators, there have been midrashim, but there have been commentators like Abarbanel, who lived late 15th, early 16th century in the Spanish world, lived through the expulsion in 1492. And Abarbanel says, I'm going to put a couple of observations on the table. First of all, I notice that at the end of the story, Avraham goes to his servants and they walk together, but Yitzchak is not there. It doesn't say that Yitzchak goes back to Be'ersheva with his father. That's observation 1, says Abarbanel. Observation 2, in the next chapter, the very next chapter, Sarah dies. Now, Sarah doesn't die in Be'ersheva. I know you're all muted, so I'm going to assume that you'd all be calling out that Sarah dies in Hebron, because that's what it explicitly says at the beginning of Parshat Chayei Sarah. Batamot Sarah b'Kiryat Arba hi Hebron. So to be fair, we don't actually know whether this is at the same time as when Avraham goes to Be'ersheva. Like nothing in the story says so. But Abarbanel says, but that's really interesting. I see Avraham returning from the Akedah and going to Be'ersheva, and then I see Sarah dying in Hebron, and that leads him to conclude that Avraham and Sarah, even before the Akedah, were not living together anymore. He doesn't speculate as to why that may be, so I'll actually leave that as an open question, but he speculates that they had decided to live apart. Now, that's observation 2. So Avram goes to Be'ersheva with his Na'arim. Sarah dies in Hebron, a different place. Observation 3, in the same pasuk, after Sarah dies in Hebron, Avraham, vayavo Avraham lispod l'Sarah v'livkota. Avraham comes to mourn for Sarah and to lament her. But Yitzchak doesn't. Why not? So you could come up with a bunch of different theories. The Rabbanel's theory is that Yitzchak didn't have to come to Hebron to mourn for Sarah because he lived in Hebron with Sarah. Avram had gone back to Beersheba, but according to Barbanel, Yitzchak had taken the opportunity to say, you know what, Dad, I think I need to separate from you after this Akedah thing. After we've had this time together on the mountaintop, it was great going on this trip, like, father-son trip, but actually, I'm not sure I want to do this anymore. And you can go back to Beersheba. I'm going to go actually to Hebron, where Mom lives. And so this is a Barbanel's theory that the Akedah is actually a rupture in the family. It essentially ends the relationship between Avraham and Yitzchak. We can add an observation that Avraham and Yitzchak are never together in a narrative for the rest of Bereshit. When we get to Perek Kav Daled, we will hear that Avraham is worried about the marriage of Yitzchak, but they're actually never said to be together. Avraham sends his Eved, the Eved comes back, not necessarily in the same place. And so the Akedah may actually be, whatever else it is, a story of piety and whatever else, and it may also be a family tragedy, because after this, Avram is never together with Sarah, Avram is never together with Yitzchak. And again, Barbanel's theory is, I think, very attractive, but even if we don't follow it, we certainly have to concede that as we read the rest of the stories of Avraham, he no longer has this family around him. He's never again going to be with Sarah, again, in the stories. He's never again going to be with Yitzchak. They just never actually talk to each other. They're never even said to be in the same place with each other. Even more surprisingly, perhaps, Avram also never has another conversation with God. In a sense, God's been his best friend in the stories throughout. If you track who he talks to most of all, this is not a question as to who Avraham, the person, actually talked to most of all, but in the stories, who we hear about him talking to most of all, the character that he talks to most is actually God. But he never hears from God directly again either. So after that Akedah, Avraham has essentially lost all of his most precious relationships. No longer has a conversation with God, no longer talks to Sarah, no longer talks to Yitzchak. And this suggests strongly that the story is, again, maybe a story of piety, but it's also a tragic story. That in a very real sense, the Akedah has ended the life of Avraham that we knew, that we watched develop over the past 10, 11 prakim. That's all come to an end. Sarah, Yitzchak, God, those relationships are all over. Now, before moving to a second point, I think this is just such a powerful observation. I just want to share it. This is an observation made by Martin Buber in his book on the Bible, one of his essays, where he just observes that the phrase Lech Lecha, which is so familiar to us because, hey, it's this week's parsha, and then, we're going to see it again next week in the story of the Akedah. God says to Avraham, Lech Lecha. And so we might be excused for thinking like that's just a normal way of talking, like it's a common phrase, Lech Lecha, go for yourself or something like that. But Buber, looks through the rest of Tanakh, looks through the rest of the Bible, and he says, actually, it's not anywhere else. This is the only place, these are the only two places that we have the phrase Lech Lecha. In Bereshit Yud Bet and Kaf Bet, Genesis 12 and, 12 and 22. And he says, well, that's really fascinating because, of course, these stories bracket the narrative of Avraham. Lech Lecha, the first Lech Lecha is the beginning of the narrative of Avraham. The second Lech Lecha is not actually the last story about Avraham, but it basically ends, certainly it ends the Nisyonot, it ends the trials of Avraham. And as we just said, it also ends the familiar part of Abraham's life. But Buber goes further and says it's not just a bracketing device. The two Lech Lechas really are mirror images of each other and provide the sort of sum total of the test that Avraham was being asked to undergo. Because if you think about the first Lech Lecha, this week's parsha, Lech Lecha me'artzecha me'moladetzecha me'beit avicha, God is asking Avraham, leave behind your entire past. Leave your ancestral home, leave the place of your birth, leave your family, and go to a new place. Where? I'll tell you. I'm not even going to tell you right now where it is. Just go to a new place. The second Lech Lecha, which introduces the Akedah, Buber says, well, that's now give up any hope of a future as well. Take the one son, in other words, the one hope that you have for there to be a legacy, for there to be anyone who survives you, and I want you to end that also. And together, the two Lech Lecha tests are basically God saying to Avraham, here, this is the hardest test that any person could actually be asked to do. I want you to put aside all memory of the past, and I want you to forsake any hope for the future, and I want you to live alone in the present on a mountaintop with God. Not like be in the moment right now, but then at night you'll go back home to your family. No, there is no more family. It's over. I want you to absolutely abandon your ancestral home and literally kill your hope for a future and just be with God. And that is actually a terrifying, horrifying test to have to undergo. Now, of course, we know like there's a slightly happier ending than what it sounds like. There is a reprieve, and of course, Yitzchak does survive. It might not be that much happier if what we said a few minutes ago is correct, and in fact, the Akedah still ended Abraham's relationship with Yitzchak, but it is a little bit happier in the sense that there is a progeny, there is descendants that survives past Avraham. But I think this is, first of all, just a brilliant literary observation that Buber makes, and second of all, it's worth thinking about because I think it's worth correcting, but pushing back a little bit on the emphasis that we have today, that we hear often, that we have to live in the present. Living the present is very important, but living the present is important when we're based in the past and also looking forward to the future. Then we often have to remind ourselves we should also live in the present. But that also is key. To only live in the present, in other words, to live with no past and with no future, that's actually terrifying. That's really depriving a human being of almost everything that we normally derive our meaning from. We derive our meaning mostly from where we come from and what we hope to leave behind us. And this idea that Avraham has to forsake the past and abandon any hope for the future is actually a pretty terrifying thing to say. And I think that does a great job of dramatizing and really bringing to life the test that together Avraham was being asked to undergo. It's a really, really tough thing to do. Now, so that's all the first observation. The first observation that all of this put together sort of suggests that the Akedah is tragic, besides whatever else it may be. The second observation gets a little sharper and asks us, or at least allows us to think that, there might actually be something that Avraham did wrong here, because it's a little bit unfair to just start with the Akedah. Of course, the Akedah is part of this narrative of Avraham's life. So we just talked a little bit about Yud Bet in the beginning of that, Lech Lecha. But of course, the previous Perek, and if you followed the Kriyat Torah, if you were fortunate enough to be in Shul this year on Rosh Hashanah, and you listened to the Kriyat Torah on the first day and then on the second day, so we have these two stories juxtaposed, right? The first story in Kaf Aleph has a number of parts, but the majority of that Perek is the banishment of Yishmael and Hagar into the wilderness. And then Kaf Bet, of course, is the Akedah. And it turns out that when you read them carefully, it's pretty easy to see that these two stories actually have a lot in common. So I don't want to spend too much time on this. So I'm just going to run through these really quickly. But in both stories, Avraham, of course, is getting rid of his son at the command of God. Banish Ishmael, kill Yitzchak. In both stories, literally, Vayashkem Avraham baboker, gets up early in the morning, takes his supplies. In both, the son is about to die. Ishmael is about to die of thirst. Yitzchak is, of course, about to be slaughtered. At the last minute, in both stories, a malach appears to offer a reprieve. The malach offers blessings for the future. In both cases, the parent sees something that seems to have been there, but somehow was escaped their notice. Hagar sees the well, and Avraham sees the isle. And both stories end with notices relating to the children's marriage. Ishmael marries someone of Hagar's choosing, and the end of Parakaf Bet, of course, we hear about the birth of Rivka, so we sort of hear that they're going to get married as well. But there's a big difference separating the stories, and that difference is that Hagar, but not Avraham, calls out to God when her son is about to die. When Ishmael is about to die, we hear that Hagar, Vatisad kola vatevk, she lifted her voice and she cried. Vayishma, and God hears the voice of the Na'ar, which I won't dwell on right now, but he hears the voice. So in the Hagar story, the fact that Ishmael is saved is very clearly a response to the fact that his mother was crying out of pain and suffering for his imminent death. In the Akedah, of course, with all of these parallels, we're waiting for that moment, but it never comes. Avraham really, pretty shockingly, never lifts up his voice and cries out to God. Now, I want to be clear, lifting up your voice and calling out to God does not mean saying no to God, right? God can say, Avraham, I want you to go slaughter your son. And Avraham could say, God, do I really have to do this? How do I watch my son die? And if God says you really have to do it, then he goes ahead and does it, right? There's nothing impious about lifting up our voice in protest of what's about to happen. If when God says, no, you really have to do it, then he goes and does it. We take that for granted, that protesting what seems to be inevitable or imminent, that's not impious at all. If that were impious, we would never have a tefillah for the cholim, right? I mean, we always protest to God and ask him to change what seems to be what's happening here. Say, God, could you intervene? So it's really pretty shocking, actually, that Avraham does not intervene, does not even try to lift up his voice in protest, doesn't do what Hagar did, and just implore God maybe one last time, could there be a reprieve? He doesn't do that, and that silence, especially in comparison with Hagar, is actually pretty surprising, and leads to, as we'll see in a second, people wondering, like, well, was that a failing on Abraham's part? Is it not just a tragic story, but it's also a story where Avraham didn't do everything he should have done? Should he have prayed? All right, so let me pause for a minute. Maharat, Ruth, I don't know if it's okay. Do people have the ability to unmute themselves if there are questions?
Here.
I think so.
Yeah. Oh, I guess someone confirmed.
Oh, okay, great. So
Hi,
let me start with the question in the chat, and then then if anyone has other questions, I'd love to hear them. And let me actually, let me just make sure I can actually see everyone. So first of all, the question in the chat, Carol and Stan, how old is Yitzchak? So this is actually a great question. It's an unanswerable question, but it's actually shocking that it's unanswerable because it seems like a really important question. And it really matters how old Yitzchak was. So the Midrash is a very famous Midrash that says that Yitzchak was 37. The Midrash says 37, specifically 37, because in the next parak, when Sarah dies, Yitzchak is 37. That's just simple arithmetic. Sarah had Yitzchak when she was 90. So when she dies at age 127, he must be 37. So essentially, by assuming that the Akedah takes place at the same time as the death of Sarah in the next parak, we get the simple result that Yitzchak was 37. That Targum says 36. There's another Midrash that says 25. The truth is, I think for the purpose of thinking about the Akedah, 25, 36, 37 are all the same thing. Because they basically all say, he's a grown-up. Like, he is a fully grown-up adult and absolutely knows what he's doing. And as Ibn Ezra points out, that means that his father could not overpower him physically to like throw him down on the altar and tie him up against his will. If he is a 25-year-old man and his father is 125 and he is tied up on the altar, he must have willingly allowed himself to be tied up on the altar. So that really matters. Ibn Ezra, the 12th century Spanish commentator, says that he's seen another interpretation that Yitzchak is 5, which is obviously not an exact number, but basically saying like he's a little kid, and that would change the story totally. That would absolutely change the way we think about it. I happen to have a 5-year-old now. We also have a 19-year-old, so I can think about the difference between those ages. So a 5-year-old So yeah, when a 5-year-old asks, Abba, where's the Sel Olah? Like, that's a cute, innocent question. I mean, it's tragic if Avram's answer is you're going to be the Seh, but it's a cute, innocent question. If a 25-year-old or a 37-year-old asks that question, that's not a cute, innocent question. That's a question that presumably comes with a lot of understanding, and then again leads to the conclusion that Yitzchak is a willing partner here. So it really does matter. The stakes are actually pretty high in thinking about the age. I will not try to offer an answer. I just will say that even in ancient times, we have a bunch of ancient Jewish art that I'm unfortunately not going to be showing you this evening. But ancient Jewish art of the Akedah in synagogue mosaics and in paintings from like the 3rd century, 5th, 6th centuries, same time as the Talmudim. And all the ancient art we have portrays him as a little kid, which I think is worth saying, because as much as a rabbi in a Beit Midrash might juxtapose Parakaf Bet and Parakaf Gimel and say, I deduced that he was 37, the reading of the story, just like a reading the story, does, I think, give you the impression that it's a kid, not an adult. It doesn't sound like an adult in the story. That's obviously not hard evidence for anything, but I think it's a really great question. It's an important question. Unfortunately, I can't say much more than that definitively. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes, please. There's a couple more in the chat.
There's another major difference, a comparison to the Hagar story, is that Hagar is kicked out of the house because Abraham's wife doesn't want her around, whereas Abraham goes on his journey at God's request. I think that's a major difference.
That's actually that's a great observation. I think that's really wonderful. And I'm actually going to use that to just very briefly address a comment that Eddie Firestone put in the chat, that Avraham also had. We've seen him protest, right? He protested when God said that he has heard there's a lot of wickedness in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he's going to go check it out and see what he has to do. And Avraham says, well, hold on, we have to see how many righteous people there are. So there's a lot of things to say, a lot to say about that, a lot to think about those two stories. I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of actually talking about them in detail, because I have all these wonderful slides with great pictures that I want to show you, and don't want to miss out on that. But I think, Marv, if I may call you that, your observation is perfectly appropriate for that as well. In the story of Sodom, God said, I hear there's a lot of wickedness. Let me go down and check and see what I have to do. And Avraham says preemptively, hold on, before you go, let's talk about the ground rules of what would justice look like. In the story of the Akedah, David Hartman says this louder and clearer than other commentators, but Hartman says, well, what's going on with the Akedah? Why doesn't Avraham employ the same protest techniques as he did in the story of Sodom with the story of the Akedah? And I think your observation is right on target and explains that perfectly. This is not the time to protest. God said to him, go do this. He didn't ask a question. He didn't say, I'm not sure what I'm going to do. He gave him a direct command, and Avram may have legitimately come to the conclusion that this is not the time for protest. Like I was just given direct marching orders. This wasn't open-ended. It's not the time for discussion. Now is my time to go act. And I think your observation, Marv, is right on target and really does a good job of explaining potentially the difference between Hagar and Avraham, and also this Avraham at Sodom and Avraham here at the Akedah.
I have a question.
Yes, I think this will be the last one now.
I'm sorry.
I've been trying to get a question. And
I apologize. So,
yeah. No worries. I'm fine. I'm happy to what is the word? Give up my space right now. But I do have a question for you.
No, I actually read your comment. I'm going to use it to segue into the next section, if that's unless you want to add something else to your comment.
But just that the last comment got me to thinking when Abraham pushes back on God, God continues to have a dialogue with him. And now when it comes to Isaac, he doesn't push back, and then it seems to me God's abandoning him. So was the test for Abraham that he should have passed? I mean, is that sort of one of the questions, that he should have pushed back? Because I am now totally confused.
So that's actually exactly why I wanted to use your comment to segue to the next thing, because that's what I want to look at in half a minute. But I'm sorry, who has started to speak? And then
that was me. I'm Ben. So what I wanted to ask is why did earlier you said that Avraham had to banish Ishmael, but had to kill Isaac. So why? And I know because he had to kill Isaac because God told him to, because he was testing his faith, all that. But I wanted to ask, why did he have to do that to both his sons? Why did he have to banish one but kill the other one?
That's actually Ben. That's a fantastic question. I don't have an answer to it. I think I'm going to take it just as an observation.
Yeah,
I think what you're saying is really important, because some people have said, "Oh, look at this! The two stories are very similar. You know, Avraham has to lose both children, and obviously that is true. But Ben, your observation is really important. But he doesn't have to lose them in the same way, and that's also important. We have to ask then. Let me reformulate your question as follows: Why wouldn't it have been enough for God to tell Avraham, banish Yitzchak? You banished one kid, now banish the other kid, you have no kids left. Why would he have to actually ask him to kill him, which seems more horrifying, but also gratuitous, if the point was simply to sever the relationship? So I think that's actually a great question, which I think could lead to some really interesting thoughts about the Akedah that I don't want to pursue right now, but I think that's a really fantastic observation and question that you're raising there.
Thanks.
Luckily, you have the next couple of weeks in the Parshiot to think about these stories, and then you can go to Maharat Ruth and tell your answers, or tell me your answers. I'd love to hear them. But I'm going to take Gray's observation and move on now. So I want to pick up on this sort of missing protest that Avram doesn't object to the Akedah. He never utters a word in protest. Now, of course, we could say, one possible response to that is what Marv said. It would have been inappropriate to protest. God told him to do something. This is not the time to protest. And I think that's would be a legitimate, plausible response. But I want to see quickly that there's at least two other ancient responses. So here's the first one. The first one is implicit in a really famous line. We said this in Slichot, this line we said in Slichot like, I don't know how many dozens of times. But it's from a Mishnah in Ta'anit, actually. The context is these extra brachot that would be added on a fast day when there was no rain. But the context doesn't matter so much. The line that's added to the tefillah is, Mi she'ana et Avraham b'hara Moriah, hu ya'aneh etchem v'yishma b'kol tza'akatchem hayom hazeh. He who answered Abraham at Mount Moriah should answer you. And at that point, we actually need to pause as readers of the text and be like, wait a second. He who answered Abraham at Mount Moriah. Who answered Abraham at Mount Moriah? I mean, who actually did answer Abraham at Mount Moriah? That's obviously God, right? That's the point. He who answered Abraham at Mount Moriah. But answered Abraham at Mount Moriah? Did Abraham pray at Mount Moriah? Nothing in the text about that. And yet this Mishnah is actually assuming that that is exactly what happened. That Abraham got to Mount Moriah, offered some sort of prayer, and actually not only did he offer a prayer, but that prayer was answered. Now there's really only a way of understanding what that answer could be. In other words, this Mishnah is saying the reason Isaac was not killed is because Abraham did offer a prayer at Mount Moriah, and God sent the angel in response. That's why Isaac was saved at the last minute. Now, all of that is not in the text. So this Mishnah, this tradition that's reflected in the Mishnah, is essentially filling in a gap in the story. They may even be filling in the gap by looking at the Hagar story, by looking at chapter 21 and saying, well, we know what parents do when their children are about to die. They call to God and God sends an angel. So in chapter 22, child's about to die, ... God sends an angel. I know how to fill in the gap. Parent must have called out to God. God sent an angel. That's why Yitzchak was saved. So here's a different response, is to simply say, oh, that silence that you're hearing in Parakaf Bet, the silence you're hearing in the Akedah, it's a false silence. Avraham was not silent. Avraham actually did offer a prayer, and the proof is that it was answered. But that's, of course, it's all out of the text. So it's hard to accept that as a compelling interpretation of the text. And now what I want to look at together, here's sort of an outline of what we're going to try to get through in the next 20 minutes or so. 6 different ways in which people have, which readers have criticized, mildly to thoroughly Avraham. So I want to start quickly with a text that's actually, I wish we had more time to introduce this text and think about it and read more of it. But it's a piyyut. So piyyutim are generally familiar to us. They're liturgical poems that are recited, part of the Siddur, part of the Machzor. This one comes from one of Jewish people's greatest poets of all time, Rabbi Elazar bar Rabbi Qilliri, who lives roughly in the 6th century in Byzantine Palestine. So this is the same time, more or less, as the Talmud Yerushalmi is being put together. A little bit later, more or less same time as a lot of the Midrashim are being put together. And he is not a Talmudic sage, he's a poet, an incredibly erudite poet who writes in a language that is Hebrew, but really dense, chock full of allusions to psukim and to Midrashim. But I'm going to unfortunately sort of cut short the background and just look at this one passage. This is from a piyyut that he wrote for Shavuot. And the context is his poem asks the question. We know, and I'm going to ask you to sort of go with me on this one, we know that the Torah existed before the creation of the world. According to the Midrash, 2,000 years before the creation of the world. So the Torah is sitting there up in heaven, and then the world is created, and then humanity is created. And the poem asks the question, so why was the Torah not given until another couple of thousand years later when we finally get to the time of Moshe? Why was the Torah not given to Adam and Chava? Why was the Torah not given to Noach? Why was the Torah not given to Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and so on? And what the poem does is go through each of these characters, and for each one, it imagines a conversation between God and the Torah in heaven, where God says, hey, I found someone for you to go to. Here's a great person. And the Torah says, no, this person's actually not so great after all. So it starts with Adam, and God says, go to Adam, and Torah says, it's not so hard to figure out what's wrong with Adam. You got one mitzvah, he failed, so not going to Adam. Noach, Torah says, well, look at the thing at the end of there. Can't go to Noach. Then he gets to Avraham. And here we get the passage you have in front of you. So I'm just going to read it in English now, mostly. Do a little bit in the Hebrew. So turning to the end of 20, meaning 20 generations, he saw, indeed, to circumcise him, I rejoiced and exulted. He burnt idols, I gazed upon him. He abandoned his family to enter my fold. From the burning furnace, I saved him, exalted through 10, that's the 10 Nisyonot, of course, with which I purified him. So this is God talking in praise of Avraham. Marked with the covenant, which I contracted and was pleased, I delighted in him, rejoiced and cheered. I found a book of the Torah. And so this is God's speech. This is great, I found this fantastic person. He did all these wonderful things. And this is the refrain now of the poem. Yoshev hayahu mechashev, chochma v'deya liyashev, yitzurim livrot, ve'olam yashev. And the Torah answers, Anta amon la'adon, la'alaso l'natzacho. The Torah answers, yeah, but remember, the young man with whom you graced him when his strength was spent, he bound on the wood of the altar. Arrested for 3 days, he offered his chick, his child. It was pleasant. His offering was accepted. He became great. His reputation spread throughout the land. Inyan kirachem av al banim b'shochecho. Atifat tzchina hayalo la'aroch b'sicho. Atayadati shimato l'shabecho, Hosea eretz bekocho. He forgot, the Torah says to God, Avraham forgot how a father is supposed to have mercy on a son. He should have offered a prayer or a plea. Now you said to him that he deserves reward for this. That's great, you praised him, but still, he forgot what it means to be a father. So this is a Torah's criticism of Avraham. When God says, look at this guy, he's so pious, the Torah says he's very pious. If anything, he's too pious. He didn't even pray for the life of his child. He should have at least offered a tefillah or a tchina. He totally forgot kirachem av al banim. He forgot what it means to be a father. So this is an explicit ancient criticism that Avraham, this goes in the direction that Gray was suggesting, that Avraham, it's not that he did everything wrong, but he didn't do everything right either. Maybe it's obvious, and the Torah here says it's obvious. The poem says that of course he had to obey, and he did well by obeying. But that's not all there is to it. He could have obeyed and yet offered a prayer for the life of his child. He didn't even do that. And the Torah seems to be saying, look, I can't go to someone who's so pious that he forgets to be a good parent. Like, what does that mean? That piety has just clouded all of his judgment vis-a-vis other human beings? Like, what kind of person would this be who's so devoted to God that he forgets what it means to be a parent? The ideal person is going to be pious, but also knows how to balance that with their interpersonal obligations. With, in this case, a really basic one, like you have a child, you better take care of that child. And Avraham is so pious that he's actually forgotten the basics here. He's just forgotten to even take care of his child. Now, I find this fascinating because, again, this is a piyyut. Where would you have encountered this piyyut? Well, if you had gone to shul in like the year 550 in Byzantine Eretz Yisrael, you would have come to shul, and right before Musaf, after the Kriyat Torah, on the Shabbat, when they read the Akedah, someone would have gotten up and said, hey, we're lucky enough to have a new poem by our favorite poet, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Qilliri. And you might have groaned, actually, because these poems are like 20 pages long. But then you would have listened, and you would have heard this criticism of Avraham in the poem. Now, what I think is so amazing about that is that this is for the masses. This is not scholastic. It's not just for the rabbis in the Beit Midrash. This is for everyone going to shul in Byzantine Eretz Yisrael. And I think, I don't know if you've had these conversations. I assume you have. I certainly, I'm on the receiving end of them all the time. Like, someone, let's say the Akedah or lots of other stories, or someone like, leans over, whispers like, this is crazy what Avram's doing in the story. Like, what is wrong with him? Or like, how could God ask that? Like, this is really, there's sort of a cynical take on what's happening in the Parsha as you're paying attention to the story. And I think we tend to think of that as a modern phenomenon. We moderns, we're cynical. We look at these stories and, we look at them with a skeptical eye. But this poem is telling you that that's not just a modern phenomenon. If you had gone to shul in Byzantine Eretz Yisrael, you actually would have had everyone like looking at Avraham and being like, yeah, what is wrong with you? Like, how could you forget to even offer a prayer for your son? Like, how could that happen? Like, everyone in shul is actually hearing that and thinking about that. So this is a really explicit and pretty dramatic criticism of Avraham. Now, again, we find in a public ancient Jewish text that everyone would have been exposed to. All right, so I want to just draw, a different way of criticizing. And I mentioned this because I think it's really fascinating, but it really is shifting gears a little bit. This is, of course, one of Caravaggio's two paintings of the Akedah. This is the one in the Uffizi. And Caravaggio does something else to us, which I think is actually parallel to what the Qilliri's piyyut does, but of course he does it by visually rather than literarily. So rather than spelling out the criticism, Avraham did not protest or worry about the life of his son. Caravaggio does it differently. And I picked this up from an essay on this painting by philosopher J.M. Bernstein. And the essay, the title is pretty much all I need to say. The essay is called The Eye of Isaac. Because there's a lot to say about this painting, and in a different context, we could really spend an hour just thinking about this painting. There's tons going on. It's really quite a rich and provocative painting. But the one thing I think that's worth saying right now is that there's only one character who's actually looking at us in this painting, and that's Yitzchak, who is violently being held down by his father, with his right eye peering directly at the viewer. He's maybe screaming, maybe just mouth open. It's hard to tell, obviously, because it's a painting. But I think even if he's not screaming, and he may well be, we I think hear and feel the pain in his face. So we were talking a few minutes ago about whether he's a willing participant or not here. In this painting, he is certainly not emotionally a willing participant. Like there are midrashim that say that Yitzchak said to his father, like, bind me well because I don't want to become a invalid korban. I want to make sure this is a kosher korban. And that is absolutely not what we get in Caravaggio's depiction. Caravaggio's depiction, Yitzchak is pleading with us essentially to intervene here because he's about to die. And of course, we also see on the left side, where he doesn't yet see the angel intervening, but by drawing our attention to Yitzchak's eyes, I think Caravaggio is actually doing something similar to what Qilliri is doing by making us say, you know what? It's not enough to think about this as a story of the piety of Avraham. That's great. And like, I love to think about the piety of Avraham. But we also have to think about the piety of Avraham that is literally being enacted here through violence to someone else who's not the star of the show, doesn't even get a reward at the end. And that's essentially what Qilliri does. It's like, well, Avraham, you're very pious, but you forgot that someone else is about to die here. Like, you should really pay attention to that. And Caravaggio also asks us to look at Yitzchak in the face. And if you look at him in the eye, it's very hard to turn away and simply say, wow, I'm moved by Avraham's piety. I think it has to be colored with, well, I'm moved by Avraham's piety, but I'm also really disturbed by what's happening to Yitzchak right here. So this painting, I think, correlates nicely with that poem, in both draw our attention to the victim here, who's actually about to die, who's otherwise sort of beneath the radar. Now, a couple of other texts, I put these both in English just for time's sake, but a couple of other texts, both from the 5th century. So again, ancient texts are a little bit milder in offering criticisms of Avraham that aren't put in the mouths of the Torah, but put in the mouths of other characters. So the text on the left is a Syriac poem. Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic, but it's a dialect of Aramaic that was used by Christians in antiquity. So this is a Christian poem from antiquity, but side by side with a midrash from Bereshit Rabbah. You'll see in a second why I juxtapose these. So the one on the left, the Syriac poem, puts this objection in the mouth of Sarah. So again, there's a lot to say, a lot to think about with the missing character of Sarah in the story. Sarah, who's been Avram's partner since the beginning, since according to the Midrash at least, she's mentioned at the end of Perek Yud Aleph, and certainly they're married at the beginning of Perek Yud Bet. They go together from Haran to Eretz Canaan, and they've been together throughout. But then she's totally absent in the story of the Akedah. And so, readers forever have been wondering, like, well, where is she? Like, why is she not in this story? I think there's actually a lot to think about and a lot to say there, including like thinking about gender issues in the Akedah and thinking about ethics and piety. But this text says, well, here's what happened when Avram got the command. Sarah woke up in the morning and she began to speak to Abraham. Why are you sharpening your knife? What do you intend to slaughter with it? You are so drunk with the love of God, who is the God of gods. If he so bids you concerning the child, you will kill him without hesitation. So here we have Sarah saying, Avram, I get you. I know you. I know, in terms similar to what Qilliri says, that you're so pious, you're so drunk with the love of God that you would even kill our child if God asked you to do this. And of course, the way she says it, it's clear that she does not think this is a good thing. To be drunk with the love of God, again, you can say, well, he's remarkably pious, and that wouldn't be wrong, but she clearly thinks that this is exaggerated. Like he's going overboard in his piety, not realizing that piety has to be balanced by responsibility and love for other human beings. So by her calling him drunk with the love of God, she is very clearly offering a criticism of his extreme and maybe over extreme piety. Now, Interestingly, the Midrash, there's no Midrash that I know of that's parallel to that in putting such words into the mouth of Sarah. The Midrash uses a different character. It uses the character of the Satan, of the accusing angel, of Satan, who walks alongside Abraham and says the most damning things you can imagine. Satan says, have you lost your mind? Will you slaughter the son given to you when you were 100 years old? Tomorrow you will be considered a murderer and you will be guilty. And the point is that the Midrash makes up the character of Satan in this story in order to have a voice for what everyone wants to say. In other words, what the Midrash is saying is that when we read the story, we need to be screaming at Avraham as he walks up the mountain, like, what is wrong with you? How can you just do this without offering an ounce of protest, without praying for the life of your child? You know that everyone will consider you a murderer, and you will be a murderer because you're literally taking an innocent child who you spent the last 30 years pining for, and you're going to offer him as a sacrifice. Like, how could you do this? And the rabbis in the Midrash essentially use the character of Satan to say things that they're not willing to say out loud, but that they know we're all thinking. So it's like a safe literary technique and say like, well, let's put Satan in here. And Satan will say the things that, again, we all actually want to be screaming, but because we also would like to be a little bit pious, we're not going to say out loud. So these two texts sort of use other characters to voice what are the real concerns that I think every reader has when reading the Akedah. And the point is that, it's a story that I think is meant to put us on edge. It absolutely does put us on edge. And in ancient times, everyone was on edge when they read this story. And that's the key point, that like the most important point that I want to make here is that when we read stories, we tend to think that we as modern people read vastly differently than ancient people. Like they were all pious and we are cynical because we live in the 21st century. And like the most important thing to say is that that's just not true. Like human beings are human beings. And like, yes, there are lots and lots of differences between the 5th century and 21st century. And, we could talk about them for a long time, but there isn't a human being in history who can read a story like this and just sort of like nonchalantly say like, oh yeah, this is great. Like, it's so wonderful what a great tzaddik Avraham is and how willing he is to obey God. Because alongside that is also this voice. We can call it the voice of Satan. We can call it the voice of Sarah. We can call it the voice of the Torah looking on. But there's a voice that every reader brings that says like, there's something wrong here. Like there's this silent Avraham just sort of walking up the mountain, piously going to fulfill the really horrifying command that God had just given him. There's something missing. And that's not a new observation. That's something that people have been saying for a long time. All right, maybe I'll pause here again, and if there's any comments or questions, this will be the last time I'll pause in the middle, take some comments or questions. Then I'm going to try to run through a couple of last texts, and then we'll hopefully have time at the end as well.
You think this is a story against extremism?
I'd love to know who said that. I'm just looking for you on the screen.
Stan.
Oh, okay. So I don't see you, but I wish I could put it as bluntly as you just did. I can't quite say in good faith that I think it's a story against extremism, but I think it is a story that really does try to get at opposing one brand of extremism, which is as follows: which is extremism that ignores the price that other people pay for my piety. So there's lots of kinds of extremism. I'm not a great fan of any of them. But the one that I think the story is really most concerned with is the extremism where I'm so pious that I don't even notice that someone else is actually suffering because of my piety. Now, I think, and I'm going to say this like really quickly, I'd be more than happy to say more about it at the end, or actually, there's like a whole chapter in my book about it. but I think child sacrifice is actually the epitome of that. The child sacrifice, I think, is actually plausibly a real act of piety. I'm not going to elaborate on that, but I think you can defend it as an act of piety. It's rejected by the Torah over and over and over again, not because it's impious, but because it's piety that literally comes at the expense of someone else's life. So I don't want to use myself because it's just too horrifying, but someone is demonstrates their piety by offering their child as a sacrifice. So, hey, they might really be pious, but someone else has just died. And that kind of extremism is what I think the story is really concerned about, where someone is so pious that they don't realize that someone else is paying the price for that. And that's unfortunately like, it's actually really common. Like, again, I'd be happy to talk more about it at the end or some other occasion. But, religious violence is essentially that kind of piety. But there's a lot of ways in which someone is so pious that unfortunately I have to hurt someone else. And that's, I think, what the story is actually very concerned about.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So Rabbi Herzfeld doesn't like my tone, so I apologize. Yeah, that's fair. This should be, so Herzfeld pointed at the chat. I think you can all see this. That I'm being too harsh on the many people who have drawn inspiration from Avraham and Yitzchak being forced to endure tragic circumstances. So that's a great point. And if we had a lot more time and we were sort of giving a more well-rounded discussion of the different ways in which the Akedah has been received, I think Rabbi Herzfeld's point is a great point, because there have been lots of readers who have looked at the Akedah as a model. I'm not going to say an uncomplicated model, but a model for a particular type of piety. I will say that the kinds of things that Rabbi Herzfeld is referring to in the chat are really extreme cases. So they're horrible. And for that reason, they're very inspiring, but they're also very extreme. So I want to sort of apologize for not giving a more well-rounded picture of all the different ways in which people have responded. But I think the interpretations that I'm focusing on now are the way that people have read this story when they're not in extreme circumstances. They're not forced with like horrible choices about their children being killed or kidnapped. They're just reading the story, and they're looking at Avraham sort of as coolly and nonchalantly as they can. And those readers tend to see some complications or even problems here. But yeah, that's a fair point. And again, there's a lot more to say. All right, so I'm gonna turn back to this and just try to run through a couple of last texts and then wrap up. I'm sorry is that okay, Mara? Ruth, if we go a little bit?
Yeah, sure. 10 more minutes, it's fine. Yeah.
No more than 10 more.
Sorry.
Okay, so I'm going to start with a modern text that we'll just look at really quickly. Hanoch Levin, one of Israel's most famous playwrights, actually has a play called the Akedah in this collection, Malkata Ambatya from 1969. I'm noting the year for a couple of reasons, but just put it in your sort of mental note. And in his play of the Akedah, where the Akedah is sort of dramatized, Yitzchak says, of course it's in Hebrew, but I translated here, Yitzchak has this very, very long speech towards the end, where he says, I don't understand you, Dad. You see that from my side, it's fine. If you're going to murder in cold blood me, the child of your old age, your precious child who's given to you as a gift at age 90, the only consolation you've ever had in life, if you are ready, then am I the person who would say no to you? Is it really such a big deal to slaughter a small, weak child? What is it in the scheme of things to slaughter a child? What's a child after all? Especially if the slaughterer is his father, a reliable slaughterer. And anyway, just a messenger. Get up, drive the blade of the knife into my young flesh, Daddy, and slice open my throat until the blood erupts and sprays on the ground like the blood of a cow. Make me a cow, Daddy. When my eyes open wide and nearly pop out of their sockets and my tongue is like sick and hangs out with my final mangled scream, then, Daddy, turn the knife in my throat while I, blood of your blood and bone of your bones, limp legs floundering on the altar as death approaches. New Daddy? I told you to slaughter, it's a slaughter. So, of course, this is a very different way of criticizing by putting into as graphic terms as possible what Avram's about to do. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to belabor the point, but it's horrible to read. Like, it's actually hard to read. There's a happy ending in Levin's play where Yitzchak essentially tricks Avraham into thinking that God has just issued a reprieve, that malach is just Yitzchak actually claiming that there was a malach. But so there's a comedic aspect at the end of the play, but this aspect, this like very cynical way, this very cynical speech that he puts into the mouth of Yitzchak is obviously like highly critical of what we can sort of get away with reading because we don't dwell on the details. And what Levin is doing is making us dwell on the details. And once you dwell on the details, it's actually just impossible to get past it. Now, what's really fascinating is that there's a Aramaic poem from the Cairo Geniza, again, from the Byzantine era, which I don't know whether to read in the same light or not. So I'll put it in front of you. And I'm really not sure whether it's actually cynical like Levin's play or whether it's just pious. So in this one, the poet says, "This is the day that they'll say, a father had no pity, a son did not delay." And then Isaac says, "How will you go and tell my mother Sarah? How will you leave me and go home?" Isaac kissed his father Abraham, commanding him, saying, "Sprinkle my blood on the altar, gather my ashes, bring them to mother. My life and my death, all is in his hand. I thank him, God, for thus choosing me. Fortunate are you, Father, that they will say that I am the lamb for the offering to the living God. Let your anger triumph over your love, Father. Be like a man who has no mercy on his son. Like a cruel man, take your knife and slaughter me. Do not defile me. Don't cry that I should not delay you. And I will take myself away from you. Why do you cry?" says Isaac to his father Abraham. "Fortune of the Lord that the world," "it is my fortune that the Lord of the world chose me." Sorry about that. So I don't know, like part of this, these lines like a cruel man, take your knife and slaughter me, sound a lot like a line out of Hanoch Levin's play. And I don't know whether this poem from 1500 years ago is also putting these lines into Yitzchak's mouth that are so graphic and make it so clear what Avraham is being asked to do, that it's actually fixing our attention on the problematic aspects of it. So I confess, I really don't know. It may well be that this poem is actually just sincere and pious, and that in this poem, Yitzchak simply says, you have to be like a cruel man in order to do this, but that's important. You should go do that. But it may also be that words like achzari and kigvar de la chayes al brei, like a man who has no mercy on his son, are meant to make clear that actually we're a little ambivalent about this and not quite sure this is the right thing to do. All right, maybe I'll just move to this very quickly. This is obviously not a Jewish text, but Wilfred Owen, who's one of the great poets of World War I, who you see, I don't know if you can see it, but I put his tombstone there because you can see that he actually died in 1918. He died in the trenches in France at age 25. And he has a poem called The Parable of the Old Man and the Young, which is a retelling of the Akedah. I'm happy to share these slides. Maybe, Maharat Ruth, maybe I'll send them to you if anyone wants to look at them afterwards. You can also just Google it, the poem's online. But it's a really wonderful poem until the end, where there's a ram caught in the thicket, and essentially the old man has a chance to save his son. But the old man would not do so, but slew his son, and half the seed of Europe one by one. So in this telling, Owen uses the Akedah as a way of absolutely focusing our attention on the old men sitting in the European capitals in Vienna and London and Paris, whatever, sending all the 20-year-olds to fight in the trenches, and then have whatever number of million 20-year-olds die while they hide in parliament safely. And he's like, well, that's the Akedah, right? Except the Akedah, of course, didn't end with a death. That would be a good model. Like if we followed the Akedah and offered the ram of pride instead, that would be great. There's, again, a lot to unpack here that we won't do. But he says, this is even worse. Here we have these old men who are just killing their kids and not being willing to turn away at the last moment. The concern there is that the Akedah has become a precedent for violence, right? That because you look at the Akedah and you're like, oh, see, Avraham was going to kill his son, so apparently it's okay to kill children. Leonard Cohen, who has a lot to say about the Akedah, and I'm sort of sad that we don't have time to talk more about him. But back in 1969 again, remember 1969 is, this is Vietnam. This is also post-Six-Day War. Leonard Cohen, not in 67, but in 73, flew to Israel to perform for soldiers. I mean, he was not, he was a complicated Jew, but he was, he certainly was paying attention to what was going on in Israel as well. And he says, you who build these altars now, you've never been tempted by a demon or a god. You were not there before when I lay upon a mountain. So he actually has no problem with the Akedah because the Akedah comes from God. He has a problem with the modern Avrahams who are sending the children off to die, building the altars and sacrificing the children, because you're not being commanded by God. To do it of your own initiative, that's just horrible. If you're tempted by God, or even tempted by a demon, you might have some excuse. But to just start a war and send 50,000 American soldiers off to die without being tempted by a God, that, he says, you're abusing the Akedah. That's not the Akedah revisited. That's simply an abuse of that story. Now, since we just mentioned Israel, I think this might be the last text that I can do. A short poem by poet Raya Harnick, who unfortunately lost a son. And the picture in the middle is a picture actually of her with her son. He was killed in the Lebanon War in 1982. But she wrote a poem in protest of the death of her son, which she has repeatedly talked about as unnecessary, and that the war was unnecessary. He certainly didn't have to die, but also in protest of the Akedah as a model for what it might mean to be a good Jewish parent. And she's like, well, I refuse. If the Akedah is what it means to be a good Jewish parent, count me out. And she writes, "Ani lo akriv b'chori le'olah, lo ani." I won't offer my firstborn for sacrifice, not I. Balelot, Elohim v'ani orchim cheshbonot, ma magia lami. At night, God and I make reckonings. Who can claim what from the other? Ani yodat u'makirat todah. I know and I'm grateful. Aval lo et bini, v'lo le'olah. But not, I'm grateful, but not my son, not as a sacrifice. And this is another way of looking critically at the Akedah. Again, this is not about whether Avraham was right or not, right? So similar to like Leonard Cohen, this is not looking at the text and saying, well, Avraham failed. That we saw plenty of. We saw plenty of readers who have said that Avraham failed in some way. Again, not that he did the wrong thing fundamentally in the story, but that he didn't do the optimal. He didn't pray, he didn't protest. These texts are not saying that Avraham failed. They're saying, I just won't be part of that. Right? The Akedah is a story that actually horrifies me. Maybe it was good for Avraham, I can't say. Maybe that was the right thing for him to do. I wasn't there. I'm not Avraham. I didn't live 3,500 years ago. It's not me. But me, not me, right? And if you ask me, well, aren't you a person of faith? Harnick says, absolutely. I talk to God every night. We talk about who owes what to whom, right? 100%. I am grateful to him for everything. But if he said to me, great, then I want your son back? No. Lo et bini v'lo le'olah. Not my son, not as a sacrifice. There's a line that I just won't pass. I won't cross here. And I love this because I think it does channel the criticisms that we saw earlier, saying like, look, I can be as pious as I want, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to ignore all my other loyalties, all my other relationships. I have to balance them. I have to figure out how to balance them. It might be a tricky business, but I'm not going to say I'm pious and therefore I no longer, I'm going to protect my son with every fiber of my being. Like I will fight for the life of my child till the end, even against God. And that's not impiety. That's alongside my piety. So I think we have to basically end there. I'm going to end actually just with this last text, which is a Yiddish text from 500 years ago, which will sort of round this out because we think of the Akedah, or sometimes we think of the Akedah as this like transformative moment. And this text ends, this retelling of the Akedah. So again, it's anonymous, 500 years ago in Yiddish. And the poet says, nah, no one should hold me to this. If you want to know the truth, I don't think much of people. I swear to you as a true Jew, they're only so pious that they would need another Akedah just about every day. In other words, you think the Akedah is transformative? It doesn't change anything. Everyone just goes about their regular business. We look at the story and we're like, wow, this is a terrible story, or it's a great story, it's an enlightening story, it's an inspiring story, it's a horrifying story. And he's like, you know what? We're going to turn the page. I promise you next week, we'll all stop talking about the Akedah. And everyone's just going to go back to their shigra, to their routines. So what do you think? What do I think about actual people, actual life? They would need an Akedah every day to actually change their lives. But be that as it may, I can't change it. I'll ask his name, blessed be he, that he hasten and end it and soon send us Mashiach. And with that, I'll conclude and make an end. And this is a totally different kind of cynicism. this is not a cynicism about the text or about the character. This is a cynicism about the story overall. It's like, we get all wrapped up in these stories, and he's like, the bottom line is, tomorrow we're all going to go back to living our regular lives. And that is so depressingly cynical that I feel like it's a good note to end on as a challenge. Because what I'd love to do, or what I'd love to say, is that we could approach these stories and try to prove this anonymous poet wrong. Not that we should emulate Avraham. There's lots to say in criticism of Avraham, but that the stories can transform. The stories should sit with us and stay with us and actually have some sort of lasting effect on us. Now, again, much of my point has been that wrestling with stories, grappling with stories, is far from a new thing to do, and it's far from an impious thing to do. That may be exactly what we're supposed to do. That we look at the stories, we look at Avraham, we look at Sarah, and we say, you know what? There's greatness here, and as Rabbi Herzfeld said, that's sometimes all we need to say. There's greatness here. But sometimes we say there's greatness here, but there's also room to improve. And sometimes we look at the stories, and that grappling, that wrestling, is actually maybe exactly what the Torah is asking us to do. So I'll end with that. I'm going to close this up. I'm going to end on that note. So if people have sort of for the last time, if people have comments or questions on the last part or anything that we said throughout, I'd love to hear them.
Awesome. Before anyone jumps in, I guess I want to experiment with a new format of doing the formal thank you so much. And I appreciate sharing multiple perspectives without feeling the need to come to any grand conclusion about a story that probably doesn't have one grand conclusion. So thank you so much. For as long as you are reasonably comfortable staying, if folks either want to type a question to the chat, feel free, or you can unmute yourselves, as long as we can find a way to make sure that stays reasonable. And if you gotta go, feel free to pop off, and thank you again. And just shoot me an email, anyone, I'll put in the chat right now, if you would like the sources.
Yeah, it's Marvin again. In today's society, Abraham would be guilty of child abuse. And as such, there have been cases where the child has sued the father, the parents. There's a great YouTube law exchange between Dershowitz and the then Attorney General of New York. It's an actual sham trial where the child is suing the abuser, his father. Secondly, I was bar mitzvahed at Ov Shalom in 1943. I don't remember seeing you. That's all.
Wow. Yeah, I don't have much comments on your second point, but your first point, it's a great point. So I think, two things I'd say. One is that as parents, it's really tricky to figure out what the line is between imposing our values on children and respecting their autonomy as, depending on the age, but developing human beings. Now, I don't want to speak for anyone else, but just raising a child as a Jew is not a simple thing. Today, it's not so complicated, but Jews have been doing it for a very long time, knowing that means that they're going to put their children at some risk, at some disadvantage, depending on the society. Male children have been circumcised, which is an act of literal violence. Yep. We do it in the name of some greater good, and look, everyone, virtually everyone heals from it relatively quickly. So it's a far cry from. I don't even want to sound like I'm comparing it to sacrifice, but it's it is an act of violence. But more generally, putting Judaism aside, we make all sorts of decisions for our kids that may cause them pain in the short run, that we are convinced are good for them in the long run, right? Whether that means sending them to a certain school or allowing them or prohibiting them to do certain things, and we certainly don't say the child's his own person or her own person, so now that she's 4, she gets to decide everything for herself. Or our daughter who's 19, she still doesn't get to decide everything for herself. Obviously, a lot more autonomy, but there's still some places where we push back and say let's try to guide you in a certain way. But that's that's a tricky balance between the parent as certainly early on, who is charged with the responsibility of raising the child, but doesn't want to overstep that and somehow violate the autonomy of a child, which I think is, is true from an early age, but it's obviously like the balance shifts over time. So you say that that it's child abuse, and I obviously like fully agree with you, like in the case of child sacrifice, and in general, our society has come down hard on any sort of corporal punishment, which is still not sacrifice. But remember that was a very gray area for a very long time, right? So it was legitimate for a parent to hurt their child and cause them pain in the name of education. That's taken for granted in the, until fairly recently, but the Mishnah, mentions as an explicit case of where if a father is striking his son for education and the son accidentally dies, that's an excusable homicide because it was being done for the right reason. So it's, that's pretty horrible for us to think about. But the point is like, yeah, where a parent has overstepped their boundaries, again, like you say, child sacrifice is a clear case where you've overstepped boundaries. But where the line actually is a tougher question. That's it's not so straightforward. The ideal, to bring back to the Akedah, the ideal in reading the Akedah, I think, is a reading that allows you to say, Avraham was right to do what he did, not necessarily perfect, again, like the tefillah thing, like that maybe he should have protested, but he was right to do what he did, but God would never ask that again. So if you ask, is Avraham a model for future parents? The answer is no. Does that mean he was wrong? The answer is also no. He was right, but that embedded in the story is that this is never going to happen again. So I actually try to argue that in the story, in my book. Oh, I should have put that up. Sorry. This is shameless self-promotion. Shameless self-promotion. But I'm going to pretend that it's an act of charity. Where is this? Here, let me put this back up. So shameless, here's my shameless self-promotion. No, that's not what I want. I'll have to go all the way to the end now. My shameless promotion is for the book. Whoopsie. Sorry. Which I'm going to say is a nice thing for me to do because it's on sale from the publisher at 50% off just for the next 2 days. So, so if anyone's interested in this book, this week is the week to buy it. So it's $40, which is not a great price normally, but it's $20 this week. So I could put that code in the chat as well if anyone's interested. I always forget to promote the book, but anyway, yeah. So in the book, I actually do try to argue, Marv, that that the story is not saying that Avraham was wrong, but is saying that child sacrifice is from now on absolutely off the table. Like if you ever think from now on that God wants you to sacrifice your child, you're wrong. That's not God. God is actually saying in the story that he will never say that again. So that's sort of one way of summarizing what I try to do in the book. But thanks for reminding me of the book anyway.
So this is great again. So my question gets back to the one that I posed earlier, and I will get your book because I'm fascinated by the subject. But as you think about it, did Abraham fail his test? I mean, how was he being tested? Was he being tested by God that he would sacrifice his only child? Or was he being tested by God that he would not sacrifice his only child? It's a double-edged sword, but where are you coming out on? I'm interested in where you came out on that.
Yeah, so that's great. So what I would say in the sort of one sentence summary is that regarding the question of should he or should he have not been willing to sacrifice his child, the answer is yes, he should have been, but that there is a broader test here, that the test turns out to have been not only yes or no, are you willing to sacrifice your child, but also how will you conduct yourself vis-a-vis that child as you're going ahead with this act? And in that regard, he didn't perform as well as he should have. So should he have done it? Yes. But did he do it as well as possible? No, because he forgot to just object or pray. It doesn't have to be like arguing with God. It has to be at least praying for the life of his child, like saying something, an expression of love, an expression of protection, something that a father needs to do for their child if their child is going to, their life is on the line. And that's something that was lacking. Was that the explicit test? No. So if the question is, did he pass or fail the specific test of the willingness to sacrifice child? Passed it. But there's more to our assessment of his character. And when we look at the story overall, we say, well, he passed the test in the narrow sense, but he didn't do great as an exemplary person more broadly.
But then the Torah is talking to God and saying, this can't be right. Right. So then where does the Torah go? The Torah and God seem to abandon Abraham. I mean, someone in the chat said, he does okay. He marries Hagar again. He has a peaceful life, but he loses, it seems to me, that connection with God. So where does the Torah next want to go? Does that go to Joseph? I mean, how is all this after? What's the next? Or Jacob? Really Jacob.
I'll sort of point in one direction that I've been playing with more recently, like after the book was published. I was like sort of wondering about things that you were just talking about as well. And I had these different ideas about gender and Sarah's role, and Carol Gilligan, and how like her book in a different voice might actually help thinking about the Akedah. But what it comes to is actually a hypothesis regarding your question. So remember Buber said that the two bracketing tests of Avraham were that he had to abandon his past and forsake a future, right? But the next time we see Avraham involved with living family members, so Kaf Gimel, he buries Sarah, but then in Kaf Daled, he arranges for a marriage for his son. And remember that he arranges for a marriage for his son with his old family back in Haran. So this is really astonishing, because then in chapter 24 in Kaf Daled, he's actually going back and undoing both of those tests. He had to abandon his family and forsake Yitzchak, but now he actually works to make sure that there is a future by harking back to his past and uniting his future to his past. So that I think is really quite fascinating. And I've been trying to like play with ways of articulating how the Akedah may actually set the stage for that. So if I had worked this out in a lot of detail, I would be happy to share it with you, but I haven't. I just have some like big ideas. So I'll put that out there for something for you to think about. But you're right. I think it's really important to not take the Akedah as the end of the story. And, Myra is right as well to say like, well, Avram's life's not over. There's another 3 prakim of stories about him. But this one in particular strikes me as like potentially really important, that actually this sort of undoes a lot of the aloneness that he seems to have here in the story of the Akedah, and says like, well, he might be alone. Like he might not be living with Yitzchak. He might not be living with his family, but he's actually arranging for Yitzchak to be the heir to his old family's tradition. And that seems like a really powerful way of continuing things even after he has sort of ended his own journey. So I'll put that out there as something that I've been thinking about, and maybe you can think about as well. Myra, I mean, just to say, like, your point's a great point. It's true. His, he seems to have this like sort of under the radar, like low key second marriage, like, marries another woman who, according to the Midrash, is Hagar, which is still a surprise, twist at the end. But in the Pshat is not even Hagar, just like a third wife, Keturah, and has a whole bunch of other kids, which is just sort of like mind-boggling, because like at this point he must be like 140. So like, the age is getting like out of control. But you're right. I mean, it's worth at least mentioning. I think it's actually
Myra
an answer, like what that's doing in the story.
Myra is my stepmom, so we both know the importance of like, more marriages and rebuilding. Seriously, like I've always been very struck by that part of the story also. So I see that David Gillers has a question. So maybe if we can do David's question, then I think we'll wrap up.
Sounds great.
Okay, and I'll try to be brief. First of all, thank you. This has really been fascinating. So I'm curious. I feel like you may be one of the only folks to be able to answer this, but I imagine that when you were writing your book, you probably did this massive survey, right, of kind of literature and midrashim and commentary and Jewish thought on the Akedah, right? And yes. This is been a topic that
actually it's sort of mind-boggling how much has been inspired by the Akedah.
Yes, from theologians to artists to poets and playwrights, right? As you've amazingly presented this evening, and I wonder, probably very few people have probably combed through all of that literature, and I anticipate that you probably combed through a good deal of it, and so I'm so curious, right? On balance, and you presented kind of a lot of different perspectives, right? But on balance, if you had to group them into, in this category is, all of the midrashim and, poets who think that, Avraham really screwed up. And in this one who view Avraham as like a model of kind of fidelity and faith, and I'm sure it's evolved over time, right? But you even pointed out that, even in the 5th century, there were folks who were very critical of Avraham. But if you had to, of the 2,000 things that you've looked at, right? Where kind of on balance, where do they all kind of fall out? Like, is there a larger category that says, yeah, he really messed up?
That's a great, it's a great way of sort of like asking me to actually be on the record with this. It's a really good question. So I think I'd say like 2 caveats. Like, one is that many interpretations don't actually bother to ask the question of like, was Avraham good or bad? Like it's just not something that every commentator, interpreter actually addresses straight on. There is, I think, a tacit assumption among many readers that what Avraham does is, well, again, I mean, I'm going to say is good, but like, I think that's explicit in the text to a large degree. The question is whether he's perfect. That's a harder question. And a lot of readers just don't go beyond that first point. Like, well, he passed the test, is sort of great, put her finger on as well. If the test was, are you willing to sacrifice your child? Yes, he passed. Like that's, maybe we can just stop there. So you're certainly right in your implication that there aren't a huge number of texts that go beyond that. But the second caveat is that a lot actually rests on like how you read some texts. Like there are midrashim that put, for example, into Abraham's mouth when God says, "Oh, don't do it, don't sacrifice Isaac." A midrash says that Abraham then like basically exploded. It was like, "What are you doing to me? You told me that Yitzchak was going to be my heir. Then you told me to sacrifice him. Now you told me not to do it." So, like, how do we read that? Is that actually a critical text that's saying like, well, here, Abraham we're putting into Abraham's mouth what we're all wondering about God. Like, God, you seem to be jerking him back and forth. It doesn't seem all that fair. So it's like it's bringing us, I don't want to say cynical because that's like only negative, but a critical eye to the story and sort of looking askance at the story and not taking for granted that even God is perfect in the story. So, texts like that could be read more toned down and be like, oh, well, this is what Avraham was thinking at that point. But if we read it sort of in a radical way, then the text is giving voice to what the rabbis were troubled by, which is like God's inconsistency. And Avraham, it also paints a portrait of Avraham who's walking up the mountain, not sanguine, at peace with what's about to happen, but actually tortured by it and maybe silent because he just can't even find the words to say what he wants to say, doesn't understand what God's doing, and finally explodes with all this pent up anger and frustration. So texts like that, if you put them together, they're not all saying the same thing, but I think there are a lot of texts that do say a lot of interesting things about both Avraham and God in the Akedah that are not just sort of a simple like, here's a test, Avraham passed it, and then we can move on. Like they're actually saying like, no, this is a more complicated story than that sort of recapitulation would allow. So I do think there's a lot of that, but it takes some work to, not just survey work. And I think as much as I tried to survey, I think there's definitely texts that I didn't dwell on enough in my work. I'm sure there are texts that if you look at again, you're like, there's probably much more going on here than appears on the surface at a first reading. And that's, so there's plenty more work to do.
This is so great. So great.
Just write more books, please.
Thanks.
Awesome. Well,
reading at a bookshelf.
Thank you again so much, Dr. Koller, for everything.
It was really a pleasure.
Tonight. Like I said, please just shoot me an email. Anyone.
What is that?
Who was like the recording, etc.
All right.
And I wish everyone a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Absolutely.